Hi, everybody. Pete Sardis back for The Lawyer You Know. The judge has ruled on Elizabeth Holmes' motion for new trial. We'll talk about the result. We'll talk about where we're going to go from here, and we'll make some predictions. But before we do that, as always, if you enjoy this episode, give me a thumbs up. If you're enjoying this series, please subscribe to our channel. And as always, leave me questions and comments down below. All right, as you remember, Elizabeth Holmes had filed a motion for a new trial. The majority of that motion was based upon a visit that Dr. Rosendorf had done to her home and some comments that Billy Evans, Elizabeth Holmes' significant other, had indicated he had made to him. There was a hearing that was held a few weeks back, and Judge Davila had basically shut down the hearing after the defense had focused a lot of questions on Dr. Rosendorf's mental state, his psychiatric history, and an article that was written either by him or about him in some South African journal where he talked about having a mental breakdown basically because of his whole Theranos saga. The court's questions to Dr. Rosendorf were basically, did you tell the truth? And did the information that the government elicited from you, was all of that accurate at the time? His response to both were yes. So the judge has issued an order, and in that order, he has denied Elizabeth Holmes' motion for new trial and has indicated that he has found Dr. Rosendorf testified accurately back in the time of the trial. He spent 6 weeks on the stand, and that the information that the Elizabeth Holmes defense team believes would have been actionable was not sufficient enough to affect the interests of justice. So therefore, that motion is denied. So what does that mean for Elizabeth Holmes now? Well, first of all, she now has an order that she can appeal after sentencing, which is coming up next Friday. We're going to try to cover that for you live, depending on how things go. As those of you that have followed this case are aware, there are no cameras inside of federal courthouses, so we're going to get information as it comes, and we'll try to impart that to you as best and as quickly as we can. So what do I think is going to happen? Well, I do believe that we're probably going to see one more last-ditch motion or an attempt to continue the sentencing. Do I think it's going to be because Elizabeth Holmes is visibly pregnant with child number 2? Probably not. What I think is going to happen is some legal reason that the defense team says we need a little bit more time in order to, figure something out, solidify something, especially since this denial of the motion for a new trial comes within a week of her sentencing. There's a good chance there'll be something that the defense will file, but we'll see how that goes. We'll keep you posted if it happens. What I do think, though, is that this is a good order for the defense on the Elizabeth Holmes appeal. And why do I think that? I think that Dr. Rosenberg is going to be a key element in Elizabeth Holmes' appeal. Why? Well, first of all, he was the lab director. He spent 6 days on the stand testifying in her case. And one of the major issues during the trial was that Dr. Rosendorf had worked for 2 other companies after he left Theranos. Both of those companies had investigations into their laboratories. One of them actually had their lab shut down. And the argument the defense was going to make was it was not Elizabeth Holmes that made the decisions that caused the bad results to come out of the Theranos lab. It was, in fact, Dr. Rosendorf. And the reason we know that is because he has had 2 additional jobs as lab director in companies subsequent to Theranos, and they've had very similar problems to what Theranos had. So the purpose of putting that testimony on from Elizabeth Holmes' perspective was to kind of put shine the light on Dr. Rosendorf and indicate this is a guy that was in charge with day-to-day operations. It wasn't me, it was him. The court, as you know, denied that motion, did not let Elizabeth Holmes' defense team or, frankly, Sunny Balwani's defense team get into that subject matter. So I think that is going to be a serious topic of appeal. Add on to that the fact that Dr. Rosendorf comes to Elizabeth Holmes' house and starts talking about some cathartic moment that he wants to have, and the defense's request to delve into Dr. Rosendorf's psychiatric history, his mental health, and just kind of what was going on in his mind at the time of the Theranos trial has been denied also by Judge Davila. I think you're going to see one big issue, and that issue is a cumulative error about Dr. Rosendorf's testimony and whether or not that was sufficient enough to affect the interests of justice and to warrant a new trial. Because at the end of the day, that's what Elizabeth Holmes really wants in this case. Of course, they're going to be asking for an absolute acquittal. Chances of that happening are very slim, but the more probable, not to say that it's going to happen, but one of the more probable resolutions in this case is that the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals sends this case back to Judge Davila for a new trial because of some error that occurred. And of course, we'll follow that as things happen. I presume, my presumption is that Elizabeth Holmes will be sentenced, or at least the sentencing is going to start on November 18th. That's next Friday. We'll keep an eye out for you. Do I think that the sentencing is going to take all day? Absolutely. I think this is going to be a complex sentencing. I think the defense team is going to put on a number of character witnesses in an attempt to soften Judge Davila's evaluation of the sentencing guideline in this case. And as you know, Elizabeth Holmes is looking at 20 years. When we did a sentencing guideline calculation a few episodes back, she scores literally off the chart, meaning that the amount of points that the judge could score against her for this crime and the relevant conduct that surrounds it is in excess of the statutory maximum. So I do think that the defense team is going to be putting on a big show. And I don't mean that to be derogatory, but they're going to put on evidence. They're going to put on witnesses to try to give the judge every possible reason to depart downward so that she can get the lightest sentence possible. But I do think that this is going to happen on November 18th. I think it's going to be a long sentencing. Is it possible that it rolls over? It is possible. It's happened before. I've had cases where the sentencing just kind of take on a life of their own, and then things just happen, and what should have been a 1 or 2 hour sentencing winds up being 8 hours or 10 hours, and the court only has so much time allotted for this case. So you wind up having to reschedule it to complete the sentencing. My gut says, again, Judge Davila is someone that's been on the stand for a long time. He has cleared the entire day for this sentencing. I think that you're going to see that Judge Davila is going to take this very systematically. I think he's going to try to keep a lot of control in the courtroom so this just does not become a runaway sentencing and things just kind of start happening haphazardly. He's going to want to do this very by the book. He's going to want to do it very systematically. What I anticipate he's going to do is he's going to go through the sentencing guideline calculation that the probation department produces. I think he's going to go through the briefs that both the defense and the prosecution will most likely file. A lot of those will be objections to the sentencing guideline calculation. I think he will go systematically, one by one, and either grant or deny those objections. Once that's done, I think he's going to do a sentencing calculation for the record, basically indicating what the probation office has identified. I think he's going to then either add or subtract points based on his evaluation of the defense's sentencing memorandums or the government's sentencing memorandums. I don't think you're going to see him depart upwards much because we're at a place where, again, because she scores so high, and not to leave Sunny Balwani out of this conversation, but his sentencing's next week, the week after, I should say, Elizabeth Holmes, not to leave him out because he scores off the charts too. So I think what's going to happen is that once the sentencing guidelines calculation is put into the record, after the hearing is held based on the objections of those sentencing guidelines calculations, I think Judge Davila is going to downward depart, or at least indicate that there is credit that might be due based on an argument in the sentencing guidelines. I think you're going to see some discussion that the sentencing guideline just overstates the severity of this offense. That is one of the possible reasons for downward departure, or what's called a variance in the sentencing guidelines. So I think you're going to see a lot of that. And then ultimately, the judge is going to allow Elizabeth Holmes to put on mitigation, meaning evidence in support of a lesser sentence. I think you're going to see probably her father, potentially some colleagues, maybe Billy Evans might take the stand, who knows, just to say things about the good things that Elizabeth Holmes has done in the course of her life, and to say that this behavior is aberrant, meaning this is so out of character for her that the court should take that into consideration. So a generally law-abiding and positive life, and this is one moment of time that does not correspond or correlate to what her normal life has been. So I think you're going to see a number of those arguments, and at which point the judge is going to pronounce sentence. Now, the big deal is going to be whether or not Judge Davila is going to allow Elizabeth Holmes to present to federal prison on her own accord. It's called self-surrender. I know we've talked about this in a number of episodes in the past. This is a big deal. And if you recall, if the judge allows Elizabeth Holmes to self-surrender, she is going to get some favor with the Bureau of Prisons, because the Bureau of Prisons will actually use that self-surrender to reduce her classification score, which is a big deal because it might get her a more lenient facility. It might get her more privileges inside of the prison, like more telephone time or the ability to have some privileges like commissary privileges and things like that generally sooner. I think that there's a very good chance that Judge Davila may allow Elizabeth Holmes to self-surrender. Now, the other side of it, in my mind, says Judge Davila may send a message. And the message is white-collar crimes and this kind of stuff, the leniency that we've seen traditionally in these types of cases is over. You commit a white-collar crime, you commit a crime where you defraud people of their hard-earned money, you place patients at risk, you lie to your investors, you're going to prison, and it's not going to be friendly. So there's the other side of me says, even though traditionally self-surrender has been the norm, there is a chance that Judge Davila may break with that tradition and try to set a new precedent from this point forward, especially since a lot of these startups.com types from the past, these types of entities really grow up in California. So it may be an opportunity for him to send a message to everybody else to think twice before they act. Other than that, if the judge does allow her to self-surrender, it's probably going to be weeks, potentially even months, because she is pregnant, and we'll see how any of those complications play out in her case, in the sentencing, and in the judge's decision-making to allow her to self-surrender. But beyond that, I think you should anticipate that next Friday we're having a sentencing, boys and girls, and that sentencing is most likely going to lead to Elizabeth Holmes getting a prison sentence in excess of 10 years. I would suggest to you that north of 10, close to 20 is probably the range that Judge Davila is going to come up with. I think that you're going to see Elizabeth Holmes, at least the defense team, file a motion or an appellate notice very quickly. They have, I believe, 12 to 14 days to actually do that, depending on how the weekend falls out. But they're going to have just a short amount of time, and I'm guessing you're going to see that notice of appeal filed right away. I would guess that as soon as that happens, there's going to be a motion to allow her to be released from jail if the judge takes her into custody, or a motion to extend the time from which she has to appear at the federal prison if the judge does grant her the ability to self-surrender. And we call that it's basically a request to not be in jail pending the outcome of the appeal. It's called a supersedious bond. They're rare, but I think you're going to see a motion for it anyway. But we'll see. Tell me what you guys think. It's been a long journey, following the Elizabeth Holmes trial. We followed the television series that went through it. We have followed all these, kind of subsects of this case. What do you think is going to happen on Friday? Do you think there's going to be a sentencing, or do you think that Elizabeth Holmes is going to find a way to get out of it and kind of throw it down the road a little bit more? Do you think the judge is going to be empathetic with her at all, or do you think he's going to throw the book at her? What do you guys think the sentence is going to be? Do you think the judge is going to allow Elizabeth Holmes to self-surrender? Do you think she's going to jail right then and there? Tell me your thoughts. If you have any questions about what we've talked about, please leave them down below. Thanks for joining us. We'll keep you posted as things happen.